Context. The context of Musée des Beaux Arts is that it was written in December of 1938, which in terms of that historical timeline is just before the outbreak of World War II. So obviously lots of those political tensions and simmerings, particularly in Europe. Obviously, it's important to acknowledge that Auden at this time in his own life is living in Belgium, in Brussels. You can remember that he travelled around a little bit in terms of his life and was exploring, I guess, or trying to explore freedoms associated with his own lifestyle. And really importantly, this was a significant period of time for Auden in the way that he was expressing some of what he was thinking and coming to understand about his own life. He'd left behind some of that really strong political persona, which obviously he was expressing through his commitment to the Spanish Civil War. And it was in this time where there was a bit of a transformational period for Auden, as he was obviously exploring a more spiritual kind of, I guess, connection to his upbringing with that religion and some of what he was then trying to come to understand philosophically from what he was seeing and experiencing. This is the time in his life also that he decides to move to America. So a pretty big decision to leave behind his life in Europe and to start something totally new in America. So this is the time frame in which he's writing this particular poem. The poem itself is drawn from the Musée Royal des Beaux Arts de Belgique. Sorry, I don't speak very well, but it's a museum in Brussels where obviously he was living at the time in Belgium. It's an institution. They're known for its extensive collection of early Dutch paintings, particularly. And obviously this is what he's actually referring to in this poem in regards to the old masters. Some key points just as an introduction. The title, Musée des Beaux Arts, translates to Museum of Fine Arts. Ultimately, through this entire poem, Auden is exploring and actually crafting a social commentary in relation to the impact of human suffering. This universal experience of suffering within humanity is represented through the lens of art, as he's actually, well, the persona in the poem is looking at pieces of artwork in this museum. He's then obviously looking more closely at a specific painting that he describes in the latter part of the poem. This painting, which you can see on the slide there, is a painting done, or there's a little bit of controversy around this painting, but it's called The Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. It's regarded, or was regarded, to have been done by quite a famous Dutch painter within the Renaissance called Pieter Bruegel. And ultimately, there's just a bit of controversy now over whether it was an original artwork or whether it was a recreation or a copy of another piece of art. But anyway, we go with what he's regarding as Bruegel's art. In Greek mythology, which this painting is actually based upon, the story of Icarus is about a young boy who actually is trying to fly with wings that his inventor father has made by using feathers which have been stuck on with beeswax. And even though in this Greek myth the father has warned the son about the dangers of flying too close to the sun, ultimately he's a little too adventurous, a little too overconfident, and does indeed fly with these feathered wings too close to the sun, which then melts the wax, and ultimately the story then goes that he falls into the sea and drowns. In this painting, you can see Icarus's legs are in the water just below where the ship is in that image. And the response here is ultimately that those around this tragedy are completely oblivious to it. They're not in any way responding or reacting to what they're seeing. They're just seeming to continue on with what they're doing. And ultimately, it's a comment, as I said, that Auden's making about the attitude towards the suffering that we see for other people in the world. The painting, as Auden's poem suggests, depicts humanity's indifference to suffering by highlighting ordinary events in life that continue and that we completely disregard. Things such as the tragic death of a young boy like Icarus. In terms of the form and the poetic structure here that Auden crafts, it is a free verse poem. It has 21 lines and there are two separate sections in the poem. It's not very clearly identified in your version in the booklet, so just be conscious of that. It's actually two stanzas. I know it doesn't look like that in the version that you've got in the booklet, but there's two stanzas in the poem. The first stanza is 13 lines and the second stanza is 8 lines. Ultimately, the first stanza of 13 lines, they all have varying line length and a different rhythm, but ultimately in that first stanza, Auden is reflecting on the artworks of the old masters collectively as he's looking at these different paintings. Really what he's portraying in that first stanza is a shift from innocence to ignorance, and it's quite a condemning kind of shift that Auden represents. The second stanza, shorter stanza, 8 lines, explores that specific artwork, the painting that we just talked about on the previous slide, Bruegel's Icarus. And here what you get is a representation of a shift to from human indifference towards suffering. And that's, again, a pretty strong social commentary that Auden's making here. The whole notion of humanity's apathy, again, is quite a critical comment that Auden crafts within this poem. Essentially what Auden's saying is that we're so consumed with our own lives and our own behaviour and actions. They always take precedence over anything that we see, and that we don't even care, or we're not even aware of the suffering and the hardship of others within our world. And if you consider some of what he's said in his other poems, this kind of aligns with that notion of the state of humanity, the condition that humans are in this context. Some pretty important uses or crafting of irony in this poem, particularly through the uses of allusion, the juxtaposition, and the free verse style. That free verse style is really important here because it's that really modernist inner monologue almost, but really cleverly kind of crafted through that third person voice. There's a use of an irregular end rhyme, again, which is quite intriguing in this poem. Many of the last words in the lines rhyme, but there's no regularity or pattern to that. It just creates this really incidental style, which kind of skillfully parallels that the whole situation that's being represented should have greater significance, should have greater meaning through, I guess, a more regular pattern, but it doesn't. It's seemingly insignificant, and it's quite clever, I think, what he does here with the end rhyme. It's this traditional play of poetic style with a twist, and that loosening and stretching of reality is really cleverly done through this kind of just, insignificant end rhyme. The varied line length is also a really important stylistic feature holistically in this poem. You've got really long clauses, strategically then punctuated with certain grammatical features that create this kind of conversational style, commas, colons, semicolons, and they build this intensity. It crafts this argument of sorts, and you've got a really important use of enjambment through the poem, and that, as I said, really links to that modernist style of a seemingly inner monologue, the musings and the thinking of this persona, which is quite clever really as he's exploring these ideas. Looking more closely at the stanzas, if we start with stanza 1, the opening line about suffering they were never wrong, immediately you get that colloquial style through the truncated statement, and that creates like an immediacy between the speaker and the persona in the poem with us as responders. It's like we've just kind of jumped straight into the middle of a conversation here. Immediately Auden's introducing the focus of the poem, which, as I've said, is suffering. It's written in that third person voice. They are the masters, and don't forget the setting here is the Museum of Fine Arts in Belgium, in Brussels, and obviously he's looking at these artworks, these famous Dutch artists, and he's reflecting on their artwork. You have the high modality never wrong. These artists were never wrong about suffering, and they knew the struggles well. Their artworks are a true reflection and representation of how humankind responds to suffering. So that immediate opening line crafts and sets up the argument that follows through the rest of the poem. Stanza 1 continuing in the next few lines, the old masters, how well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. This is an allusion again to the old masters, those famous painters whose artworks are in this fine arts museum in Brussels. Lines 3 to 8, of which these lines fall within that bracket, are believed to be an allusion to another painting by Bruegel called The Census at Bethlehem, and I've included an image there of this artwork. What it's believed to be is this is what Auden is actually representing in this part of the poem, this actual artwork here, where you can see some of the ideas that he addresses in these lines being represented. The human position in these lines refers to the representation of suffering, again as part of this human condition, this universal experience of humans. While people were ignorant and indifferent to others' sufferings, these artists were very aware of this human experience. And what Auden's saying is they were able to accurately represent the suffering and the indifference within their artworks. There's pretty powerful uses of imagery in this longest phrase in the poem. This phrase is 14 words if you count it. And what it's doing here is listing. It's listing the different activities that individuals might be engaged in while others are struggling and suffering unspeakably. And some of these activities are seen in this particular artwork. You've got the present tense as well. The present tense in eating, opening a window, walking, all of those present descriptions reflect the mundanity of the suffering in everyday life. And as I mentioned, you've got uses of the end rhyme here, which again create this incidental effect, this lyrical style, and it's almost seemingly light-hearted, but it creates that really undertone of mocking and the seriousness of the oversight, which is the irony which Auden powerfully creates within this poem. The next few lines in stanza 1 continue, how when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. So as I said, that's obviously continuing some of the description of what we see in that painting. Again, you've got an important use of anaphora here with the repetition of how in those lines. What that creates is this accumulative listing effect, and it creates that argument, which the argument weaves through this poem. There's a juxtaposition here between the aged and the children, so the older people and the young, and their different reactions and their conflicting emotions in response to situations. The adults are described as reverently, passionately waiting, in contrast to the children who did not specially want this to happen. So you've got a juxtaposition and a contrast between the responses. You've got a biblical allusion, which again, that painting is a reference to Bethlehem, which we know is the birthplace of Christ. So you've got a biblical allusion in the reference here to the miraculous birth. Really what's being represented here is some sort of significant event within human experience. The imagery is important in describing the innocence, but also the ignorance of the children. And what they're doing in relation to this miraculous birth is they are skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. So this whole representation and image of being completely oblivious and unaware, a little unsettling as well, I think, the undertone here of potential dangers, the skating on the pond and the edge of the wood. There's connotations there of danger, and that oblivious kind of notion, it creates that really kind of serious edge to what Auden is representing, obviously linked to his context. The enjambment again creates this ongoing nature, this pattern of behaviour that continues. And again, that's accompanied by the end rhyme here, which continues throughout different lines using the end rhyme. Stanza 1 continuing, they never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. These lines 9 to 13, which conclude stanza 1, are regarded again as another allusion to a different Bruegel painting, which is called The Massacre of the Innocents. I'm not going to go into any details about that particular artwork other than to say that it's there, obviously copied on this slide, and you can see ultimately some of what he's representing in regards to this torture and this killing of the martyrs. It represents ultimately the importance of suffering and how it's remembered or overlooked in terms of a response by those who are witnessing this situation. You've got the repetition of they, which are the old masters. What you get in these lines is a seemingly detached tone, a sense of understatement in the line, dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner. So really what Auden's crafting there is this extreme suffering and the sacrifice of martyrs being completely overlooked and not appreciated for how significant that is. What Auden's representing is that ultimately this situation of martyrs is really fading into the background. And obviously it is in the background of that particular artwork, and it's being overshadowed and completely overplayed by the continuance of mundane life and activities in the normal world. The enjambment again in these lines is important because it's representing that this is an ongoing situation throughout humanity. It's not just one particular situation, it's this ongoing response throughout human history. Again, you've got this very strong irony in describing this extreme suffering and sacrifice of certain individuals in contrast and in juxtaposition to the dogs in their doggy life continuing and the torturer's horse who scratches its behind on a tree. There's a really mocking undertone here again of this serious kind of juxtaposition between the deaths of these individuals and the sacrifice of their lives in contrast to these animals who are just continuing on with their animal lives in these really mundane descriptions. This imagery powerfully crafts the human tragedy being overlooked in a world where, again, this mundane life is the focus and what we continue kind of prioritizing, I guess. And it's taken precedence. And again, this crafts this very critical undertone of Auden in the poem, really criticizing this response and attitude of disregard within humanity. You've got a full stop here. We've not seen any previous full stops up to this point in the poem. That concludes this stanza, and that really creates a punctuated pause here for us as responders to reflect upon some of this injustice through the comparison between the animals and the human suffering. Stanza 2. Stanza 2 moves into a specific focus. You can see here a direct reference. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry. So here you've got, as I said before, the focus upon this particular artwork. It's an allusion to that specific painting by Bruegel. Let's not go into any of that controversy over whether it's his artwork or someone else's. It's called The Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, and it's an example here of Auden's message, ultimately, about the ignorance towards human suffering. That's the crux of this whole poem, obviously. Auden utilises a technique here called ekphrasis, and it's describing the vivid verbal description of a piece of art within another text, within a poetics or a speech or another form of literature. So here the painting is an allusion, obviously, to the Greek myth of Icarus, which I've already told you about. Really, that myth is all to do with the notion of hubris, and hubris is the quality of excessive pride or overconfidence in someone's own abilities, and what that then ultimately leads to is their own downfall. That particular pride and overconfidence causes them to ultimately be destroyed. Lots of literature explores hubris, but that's the essence of this story. You've got the quote here, "How everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster." This really is, in essence, what Auden is representing in this poem. It's the complete ignorance and apathy towards the human tragedy that's being represented in this particular artwork. Leisurely, that use of the word leisurely creates a critical tone again, or repeats the critical tone. It's suggestive of perhaps a choice to disregard, whereby it's more than just ignorance, it's actually an arrogance almost, a choice to continue on and focus on our own life and having the precedence of our own life over concerning ourselves with the suffering of others. And that again is a very critical commentary that Auden is crafting. The individual response here is firstly important to consider. He crafts initially the individual. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, and you've obviously got auditory imagery there, the sounds of those, the splash and the cry of Icarus's tragedy as he fell from the sky to the ocean, and the ignorant attitudes and the complete disregard of the ploughman, who you can see is continuing his farm work at ploughing the field there with the horse, which seemingly is more important than helping the boy as he drowns in the ocean. Stanza 2 continuing, "But for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on." That's concluding the poem, obviously. You've got here a very dismissive tone, obviously, in the opening line of this section, not an important failure. It's a complete attitude of disregard. It's a justification for not caring. It wasn't an important failure to not respond to this splash or cry of the boy. The sun shone, this cyclical nature, this ongoing pattern of the sun continuing to shine despite this significant tragedy. Again, there's an interesting use of pathetic fallacy there, where the notion of the sun continuing to do as it had to, this metaphor for attitude, again, of this justification of disregard. Well, the sun keeps shining, so I need to keep doing what I'm doing, is the sense of what's being represented here. There's vivid imagery again in the white legs disappearing into the green water. Again, there's that very important use of enjambment that creates that unsettling effect in the description. And you'll remember that in some of Auden's other poems, particularly the one we've just looked at last week, you've got that very important use of enjambment, which does create this disturbing kind of unsettling sort of pattern through the poetry, even though you've got an interesting use of end rhyme, which should create a regularity to the rhythm. The enjambment, as we're reading that poetry, kind of disrupts. And again, that's a really important crafting by Auden here. What he's exploring in the last part of the poem is the collective response, and obviously different to the individual, but the same response. The expensive, delicate ship is the collective here, and really perhaps critical attitudes of Auden in regards to the affluent and the wealthy. Remember, we've seen that in some of his other poetry, September 1, 1939, for example, the criticism of the West in not doing more to prevent World War II. So here's a little bit of that same criticism, perhaps. It's emphasised through the high modality of must have seen. They must have seen this tragedy, and yet they're not responding with any kind of help for the boy. The descriptive language in something amazing accompanied by the striking imagery of a boy falling out of the sky. Like, how much more significant could a situation be than seeing something like this? And what it does is emphasises the extent of the ignorance and the apathy, when not even a situation this significant can stir a response in the witnesses. And ultimately, this is the crux of what Auden's message is here, is that we've become so immune and so desensitized to this situation of suffering that we don't even respond to something so dramatic as seeing someone fall out of the sky. Again, as I said to you last week, it's continuing on, obviously, with what he's looked at in the Shield of Achilles, but obviously the Shield of Achilles is written much later in terms of chronological time, but those same messages are obviously interplaying in these poems. The critical tone in the final line, always the final lines in Auden's poems, are very powerful. Had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. Completely unmoved by the situation. There's this strong and powerful image here of apathy, completely continuing disregarding this situation. There's no response and no reaction to the suffering of Icarus in the artwork. Final points in this poem, and it's good because there's a brevity to this poem, but a very punchy message, as always with Auden. Obviously, Auden powerfully explores the human condition within Musée des Beaux Arts to represent how we fail to see the suffering of others in the real world. In contrast to this human indifference towards suffering, Auden represents that art actually does represent the truth by revealing this ignorance and apathy of ordinary people through depicting the real struggles and the passions of humankind. So again, you've got this really interesting interplay between reality and the role of art and the role of literature, and exposing some of these situations and the human condition within the real world. Again, as always, contextually, Auden is responding to his own context by representing the disregard and the desensitized response of human nature, and especially in response to the intense anxieties of the 20th century world. Obviously, written in 1938, this poem is obviously responding to many of those moral and political challenges that we see Auden exploring in other poems within his collection. Very importantly, as a final point, through his philosophical and conversational musings within this particular poem, Auden powerfully crafts his social commentary about the impact of human suffering through most predominantly the skillful allusions and also the broader extended metaphor to the specific artwork that he's representing here as a comment about the impact of human suffering. So again, a really important poem, quite a punchy, much briefer kind of exploration, and a very interesting one. The reason we've chosen this within the collection is obviously it's a little different, it's a little broader in terms of its scope, but some really interesting ideas that kind of parallel with much of what we've looked at in the other poems already. So again, something to consider in terms of a broader exploration of human experience, particularly through human suffering as a focus. That's it for this one.